You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Professor Andres Sevtsuk, Professor of Urban Science at the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning. Andres talks with us about his book, Street Commerce, Creating More Vibrant Urban Sidewalks. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show. We couldn't do it without you. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month and I'll send some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month and you'll get one of our bus-only scarves with dedicated lane designs. And finally, every donation will have access to bonus features, including podcast extras that might not fit in the original cut. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of The Overhead Wire, sharing information on cities around the world with our readers and subscribers. Join us and try our one-of-a-kind daily newsletter for 2 weeks free. No credit cards, just an email address by visiting theoverheadwire.com. We've got 71,000 news links in our archive tagged by topic, so sign up and search away. And finally, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning in Practice. Go to raymondunwin.com to find out how you can download the book in your podcatcher and listen to each chapter like an episode of the show. We have a free Word document with timestamps on the site as well. Well, Andres Sevtsuk, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I teach at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. I lead a research group there as well called City Forum Lab. And I'm an urban planner and urban designer by training.
How did you get into planning? Were you a little kid? Were you older? What was the time frame when you got into it?
I think I got into it actually during graduate school. I'm an architect by undergrad training, and I worked as a designer architect for a while. I did my undergrad actually in France, and as I studied more about the built environment, I suppose I just got more and more fascinated by topics that are urban planning in nature, that go beyond the scale of individual buildings or individual clients and deal with really complex social issues and become social science. And I guess I always had a fascination with kind of addressing more complex problems, and that's how it went.
And then you wrote this book, Street Commerce. How did you get into the retail environment? Like, what brought you into that world?
I wrote a dissertation some years ago about the location patterns of stores, service amenities, and food providers. And it just seemed one of those topics that we all encounter. It's so ubiquitous. It's one of the most prominent interfaces to city life for those of us who live in cities. Yet I didn't know of a good book on the topic. It's something that many planners have talked about, but not necessarily centered their whole discourse or focus on it. You know, all the way from the Chicago School of Sociology in the early 20th century, through Jane Jacobs, through many urban designers and planners, the idea of amenities on city streets and how they impact social interaction, how they may impact local economies or urban sustainability. It's a topic that comes up fairly frequently, yet has not been, I think, brought together very much in a sort of single book or a single treatment. So what I tried to do is take these interests that are part personal, part professional because of the field of planning, and synthesize them in one place.
Well, you mentioned the personal, you talk about in the start of the book, living in London and walking around, and it's definitely a great retail environment. What was your experience with cities previously in terms of how you embraced them or how you experienced them?
I've lived in quite a few different environments and always loved cities and lived in cities. I never lived in a countryside other than, for an extended weekend or a summer camp. So I grew up in Estonia. That's where I'm from. I grew up in a mid-sized, I guess in the American sense, it's a small town, but in a fairly dense urban environment full of apartment buildings. And then I lived in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, when I started my studies. And then things took their own path. I ended up doing my undergrad in France, and I lived in Paris for 3.5 years. And that's sort of a hyper-urban experience, I guess. From there, I ended up in Boston for grad school, which is a very different kind of urban experience, which may look somewhat European, but actually works entirely different from European cities. And then somehow life ended up taking me to Singapore to start a teaching job there in one of the MIT affiliated universities in the world. And Singapore is yet another completely different context. And then I ended up spending some time in London after that. So lived in quite a few different cities, and always, I love city life. I love the vibrancy and the diversity and sort of cultural learning that cities provide. And I think this has helped feed that interest too to local commerce. I mean, it's one of the favorite things to do is in a new city, kind of just poke into stores and see what they sell and what they do and what they tell you about the city. Especially locally owned smaller stores that are not necessarily the chains you find anywhere else in the world.
Do you have a favorite city of those that you've lived in? Or can you not pick one?
It's hard. I get that question quite a lot, actually. But, it's really, I do love London. In part why I started the book by describing London for many reasons. But yeah, different cities have their different advantages. London's great because it really has historically put high streets at the center of its kind of urban agenda. It has so many different programs for supporting high streets, and they become not just places of convenience and getting your errands run, but they're really the centers of life. Every neighborhood has its own high street, and it's kind of the whole city is structured around those.
So you talked about the educational environment. I'm curious why you think that urban commerce isn't discussed as much in planning schools or in kind of an educational environment.
There are a couple of reasons, I believe. One is that urban planning in the United States has really come to focus on what we call market failures, areas of development that we believe private capitalist markets cannot take care of themselves. So, for instance, public transport, education, housing, public space and streets are things that the private sector has no incentive to develop on its own because the kind of benefits bleed out to everybody. It's hard to monetize them. It has traditionally, I think, been believed that street commerce or commercial activities are something that the private sector takes care of, that we don't necessarily need to worry about very much as planners, as stewards of the public interest. And I actually have come to believe that that is not entirely the case. There is a whole lot that cities can do to support street commerce, and that's not an outcome of pure market forces. So that's reason number one. And reason number two, I think urban economics and retail economics in particular has developed quite a bit of writing about stores, but almost all of that literature has focused on shopping centers. And shopping centers have been the sort of creation of the 20th century that completely revolutionized how we get stuff in the city. And there is quite a bit of literature and science around shopping centers, about their location, about how they work. But fundamentally, shopping centers are different animals from urban, diverse, fragmented street commerce.
Yeah, that was a really fascinating part of the book where you talked a little bit about shopping centers, but also the difference between the two and how much, analysis went into looking at the urban retail environment. It was interesting to think about how places cluster and also the distances people would walk and et cetera. I mean, you have a lot of analysis in the book. Why is the focus so much in the US, at least on these suburban centers? Is it just because we had this kind of movement that never backed down, whereas other places like the Netherlands and Copenhagen and all of those places outside of the US, kind of reversed tack in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, I do think in part it's perhaps because the shopping center is considered a sort of American invention and something that has been exported to the world over. But at the same time, there still are very powerful private interests around shopping centers. They're far from gone. I do mention in the book that we have sort of given up building the traditional shopping center as of the last decade or decade and a half. We don't do a whole lot of this sort of introverted atrium-centered shopping center with massive parking lots around. The new era shopping center looks quite different. It actually looks more often urban. But nevertheless, the distinguishing feature of shopping centers is that it's a coordinated, centrally managed cluster. And there are very powerful, large interests around that. The International Council for Shopping Centers and various organizations that pool together developers, retailers, has created a whole wave of interests around the sort of benefits that shopping centers have brought in. And I think back to this notion that planners have not really, there is a sizable literature on main streets, but not necessarily from the perspective of trying to understand the economics of how the uses behind the walls on the main street, the services, the retailers, the food places, how they work. And it's sort of fallen between the cracks, I think. And, the book is in a sense timely because it's happening. Cities are turning back towards downtowns. Main streets and community streets are a bigger topic again because population preferences have shifted. But it's simply not been a central concern, I think, for planners.
Yeah, though it still comes up. I mean, I've often gone into cities and, I mean, you mentioned the Olympics in London in 2012. I was there. And one of the things that I do when I go to bigger cities, because there's these shops that, can basically cover a whole city, is I look for antique maps, mostly of streetcar lines, mostly of stuff happening between 1880 and 1920. But you can't find those maps or map stores necessarily unless you have a big enough kind of catchment area. And in the book, you talk a little bit about this taxidermy shop, right? The place with that, you do know why it has a business because it has such a large catchment area. But that shop versus food and retail is such a different animal. I'm curious how you came up with the discussion about why certain shops work, why certain shops don't work.
Yes, this goes to the heart of this theory of urban retail catchment areas. This taxidermy store that's called Get Stuffed was something that I passed on the street on Essex Road, close to where I lived. And, you can't help but wonder how many people will go and buy a stuffed full-scale taxidermy product. I mean, I certainly never have. And so it's one of probably the rarest purchased items in cities. But I think it's a great store to illustrate the point that if you look around cities and just kind of anecdotally try to detect what is on city streets, how often do we see a baker, or how often do we see a liquor store, how often do we see a convenience store, speaks directly to one of the primary kind of economic criteria that defines how much street commerce of a particular type there is. That is frequency of purchases. The more frequent we buy something, the more of that store we generally see. And that's not the only criteria. There are other intermediary factors that shape the density of stores, but that's a big one for defining the density of stores. So for instance, coffee shops or bakeries or convenience stores are things that a lot of people visit almost daily, and we see them a whole lot. A taxidermy store, that Get Stuffed store, is really the opposite end of the extreme. It's so rare that you may have one in an entire metropolitan region for those kinds of things. Walter Kirchsteiler, the German geographer who first defined this theory of central places in the 1930s, I mean, he already conceptualized this idea of catchment areas and overlapping catchment areas, and basically argued that bigger settlements, bigger what he called central places, but you can sort of substitute that for cities, will have these rare stores because they simply demand an enormous catchment area to stay afloat. And I think the same goes for other specialized goods. And that's one of the fascinating things about big cities. If you go to cities like Hong Kong or LA, you'll find these highly specialized clusters of something that is never found in a small town. And that's very much why, because they require such huge catchment areas to stay around.
Yeah, antique map shops.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, yeah, you talk about purchase frequency. There's fixed costs, transportation costs, customer density. There's all kinds of factors that go into it. But you also did an analysis of the size of cities and how many stores the cities could handle. And it was interesting to read that some places have more than the number, and it's actually pretty correlated in terms of the metropolitan population. But some places are different. I mean, you have Myrtle Beach, which you mentioned, and even Paso Robles, which have tourist destinations, and so they're going to have more shops. But then you have other places that have less shops. Were you surprised to see that there was a basic correlation between the size of a metropolitan area and the amount of stores that actually each city had, and that they kind of diminished as the city got larger?
Yeah, I would actually say that, the fact that the size of a metro area and how many stores it can handle is a fairly intuitive finding, right? Most people would say, okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. But what was surprising was maybe a trifecta of several systemic, predictable aspects to the retail pattern in cities. I mean, the fact that there is a predictable amount of stores, and if you know the size of a metro area, you can fairly accurately guess how many shops it'll have, is the first of those factors. Second is the sort of distribution that follows Zipf's law, which is this sort of linguistic law, but appears in almost every domain of science, that things are exponentially distributed, that there's very few large clusters and then more middle scale clusters and then a whole lot of small ones. It turns out that if you take that number of stores that the metropolitan population predicts and put them into a Zipf's flaw pattern, you can also fairly well guess how many clusters of what size you'll have. So the distribution is fairly regular. And furthermore, there's evidence that the sort of spacing between those clusters is fairly predictable too. And these three factors together are somewhat surprising together, that there's actually a whole lot of predictability to the retail landscape of a city. But it's somewhat of a contradiction that if I go to a new town that I've never been in, I think of the stores and the streets I walk as the unique face of that city. So on the one hand, I think of cities by their streets and what we see along these streets. And that's the unique characteristic that in my mind, in my memory, will define what that place is. But at the same time, it appears so predictable. So the book also tries to situate itself in that space between the predictability and the uniqueness of retail clusters, and essentially investigates what are the levers, what are the parameters that planners can influence at all. I mean, in part, it's the street commerce is a result of economic forces, densities and costs and transportation, etc. But at the same time, there's plenty that cities can do, what policymakers can do. And that's, I think, the really interesting buffer zones between the sort of science of it and the art of it. You know, those examples you mentioned, also Paso Robles or Myrtle Beach, those are in particular tourist sites, but there are other factors that make cities punch far above or also far below the kind of trend line. For instance, the town where I work in Cambridge, Massachusetts, has a whole lot more restaurants than you would think. And it's because the demographics, the incomes are higher, but there's also a whole lot of people who like to dine out and are perhaps more international than the average town in the United States. And that benefits the restaurant economy. And in some towns, you'll have less than you would expect by the size of the town. And in those cases, oftentimes the commerce is concentrated into very few big providers like a single shopping center or something like that. And I find those really interesting, that space between the sort of predictable pattern and that which is a result of local deliberate efforts.
What are some of those local deliberate efforts? Because we often see places that just kind of allow commerce to happen. They believe in the visible hand of the market, et cetera, capitalism generally. But there's so much stuff you can do as a city to kind of influence how retail actually works in the city and whether it's, beneficial to people or whether the clusters actually work or not.
Yeah, I mean, the ways in which cities can influence that pattern actually are really diverse and wide-ranging. At the macro level, I think density is one of those things that truly influences the kind of city you get in terms of its retail pattern. Denser cities produce shorter trips, and on average, you have a lot of things close by, so people tend to walk more rather than drive, and that produces in turn a finer grain of stores along streets. In cities that are lower density and car oriented, generally you end up with large shopping centers that absorb most of the purchasing power in the region. So density and also investments into public transport are some obvious big ticket things that really shape the retail landscape of a city. But at the smaller level, even at the sort of scale of individual streets or main streets, there's other things like investments into the public space along the street goes a long way on bringing people out and equipping streets with things that no store alone can provide, like landscaping, like better sidewalks and pavers, like good street furniture, decent sort of arrival mechanisms like bike parking or street parking and things that enable people to get there. And then I think the third or most microscopic scale that cities can really get directly involved with is providing policies and incentives. So I cite in the book some pretty unusual examples, for instance, from London, where a borough of Hackney has gone in as a public sector player and bought up vacant storefronts and then subleased it to the kinds of stores they think that should be there. So this is taking a really active role on behalf of government to say, we think that this cluster would really benefit, let's say, from a grocery store. Well, none of the landlords are willing to give it a good lease. So the grocery stores haven't come. The area may be too pricey or for some other reasons they can't come in. So we're going to maybe take even a hit. We might lose some money in the process, but we think this is good public policy. We'll put in the store. in the context of Boston and close to where I am, you'll have big institutional players who do exactly that. So for instance, the universities will own a lot of real estate, and they will oftentimes lease out some space at bargain rates just to get certain types of businesses in, which benefits everyone. And this is touching upon this idea that coordination can go a very long way in making a cluster work. And that's the key benefit that shopping centers have and street commerce usually doesn't have.
Yeah, the central management, that's something that you brought up about the shopping center, shopping malls, was that they have kind of one overarching owner, and then they try to sort the stores inside based on, their tenant mix. And you have the anchors at each side, which bring in the traffic, and then they'll rent out stores based on, whether they think it's something that they need that is of interest, but maybe they'll give it to the store for a lower price. So cities can do that exact same thing. And it's interesting to think about, and you mentioned this in the book too, is how Amazon is doing this as well. Basically, one central management for everything. And it creates this kind of economy of scale that can't be kind of replicated by individual stores in a city, which means cities have an even more important role if they want to preserve their retail establishments.
That's absolutely true. Yeah, one way of looking at Amazon is as sort of the next generation of the shopping center, where it's extremely centralized in the entire ecosystem that falls under one big owner, right? I think one of the key points I try to make in the book, and I particularly go and talk about this one example from Tallinn, this called the Telliskivi or Brick Center. And it's an urban cluster, and it works in some ways like a shopping center, but it flips the model upside down. So maybe I'll just describe briefly what that example entails. So in a typical shopping center, just as you described right now, the anchors are the highly subsidized units. They are thought to bring in the foot traffic, and the intermediary stores where the highest foot traffic is inside the mall is where the rents are the highest. And that's where all the profits are made for the shopping center. Now, this Telliskivi Center or Brick Center in Tallinn did the opposite. It subsidized a lot of small operators and mostly small creative businesses, and created this sort of really desirable and active sense to this cluster that's in a former industrial complex close to the city center. And it became such a desirable destination that larger companies wanted to join in because it had a very strong sort of location value. And that's what the management did, is they started charging these established large companies top dollar rents. And that's where their profit comes from. So in a way, it proves that you don't have to use the sort of 20th century shopping center model to revitalize urban street commerce either. It doesn't mean that we need to put big box stores in the city centers to get the traffic in. The same logic could apply to a whole cluster of small stores. And indeed, that's something that's been missing. I think oftentimes when municipalities subsidize in all sorts of forms retail, it's oftentimes through infrastructure or tax breaks or tax incentives and so forth. Almost always those incentives have gone to large big box stores. And, that's, I think, one of the challenges we have ahead of us for the 21st century is to rethink that and see how we can actually subsidize the kinds of things we want to have. And I'd argue that it's oftentimes more beneficial to try to lure in lots of small local stores that define a place and that people love, and then flip that sort of subsidies models on its head.
That's a really good point. We're talking a lot about movement of larger companies and cities and the subsidies that they're given. Amazon HQ2 was a big discussion over the last 2 years or so. But in the book, you mentioned how much money kind of comes back to the local economy if people spend money in these more local stores. You said 45 cents comes back to the community in local stores versus 13 cents per dollar in chain stores, which means it says to me that, all this subsidy of these larger big box stores is actually kind of damaging to the economy. It might be an initial boost from, investing in these places and the jobs that they have right away. But over the long term, the smaller community stores and the local places that people love are the ones that we should be investing in. So I like your point. It's harder work, obviously. It's easier to give money to one company and sign the papers for one company than it is for, 100 local stores. But it seems like it's totally worth the work if you put it in.
Absolutely. And that's exactly right. And I think you're also right that that's the key reason this is happening not frequently is that politicians like to sort of have one big achievement, one big Walmart brought into the town, and that'll end up in the mainstream news and be covered in many places. But It's a much bigger job to work constantly with smaller vendors and have more locally oriented stores lured in and subsidized it, or at least, if not subsidized, that we should sort of level that playing field and not subsidize the big box store. And that's harder work, but it's a much greater payoff. And I think not just economically. Yes, there are studies that show that locally owned stores tend to procure more from local sub-vendors and get their services and inputs, and even down to furniture or deliveries or the transportation, they hire more from local companies, right? And I see that every day. I mean, here in the Boston area, local companies certainly interact more with other local companies, and that network is really impressive. So there's an economic benefit, but beyond the economics, I think it just produces a whole lot of great things for cities, right? We all like the sort of diversity on city streets, and I try to make the point in the book at multiple locations that it's also an ecological argument that the more businesses we can walk to in the city, the more we can address CO2 emissions and urban energy consumption, because something like 2/3 of all trips in cities are non-work trips. So only about 1/3 is sort of the routine travel to the office or to the job and back home. And 66 or so percent of trips are leisure, commerce, personal, and many of these trips are in urban retail clusters, if available.
Yeah, and that goes to that discussion that you have as well about the importance of transportation. How important is transportation to urban commerce specifically?
There are two types of sort of transportation arguments to be made. One is how many people can get to these clusters on foot without even having to rely on any system as a car or a public transit system. And I try to show that there's actually a good deal of cities in America where already over half of the city's population is within walking reach of urban retail clusters they can walk to. In some cases, and in an extreme case, in Manhattan, for instance, it's virtually 100%. From every census block, you can walk to a cluster of street commerce on foot. And that's a density argument. The denser the cities generally, the more people can actually get to these stores on foot. But urban street commerce works very well also in tandem with public transport, and it requires transport land use and sort of local urban design coordination to achieve these goals. Because in many instances, we don't have all that much density, and stores actually require people to come from further places, especially when we have these higher order stores that have larger catchment areas. And so coordinating where we put transit investments and where do we zone for street commerce and where do we do street improvements in urban design, I think it requires this kind of cross-sectoral thinking that transport's not a separate problem from local economic development, and local economic development is not a separate problem from public space and urban health. These are sort of cross-sectoral topics that align, and I try to make the argument that while they may align in many areas of planning, main streets and local main streets, street commerce are areas where they really come together elegantly, where it's sort of this thing in cities that has a myriad benefits, and it's a great vehicle for coordinating land use, transport, and local economic development policies. And it's a sort of a way of organizing otherwise very complex and disjointed planning issues.
Yeah, it's really important. I want to talk about the sociological impacts. In the book, you talk about the ties. So there's weak ties and strong ties. But weak ties seem to be more important, even though the word weak is kind of many times seen as a negative. What is a weak tie?
Yes, this notion comes from Mark Granovetter, who's a sociologist who published a lot on this topic of social networks in the 1970s. And in one of his papers that's entitled The Strength of Weak Ties, he summarized how weak ties in society represent these connections that many of us have with folks who we don't meet all that often, but which are extremely important for transmitting information through societies and giving people access to opportunity. So for instance, Granovetter demonstrated that many of us are more likely to find a job through somebody who we meet a couple of times a year rather than somebody who we meet every day in our office or home. And this is in part due to the fact that these weak ties, these connections we meet every couple of months or weeks or years even, we have a whole lot more of these weak ties than we have strong ties. I mean, the people we work with or sit at home, which he refers to as strong ties, are much more limited. So that's what the weak ties are in that context.
I also kind of extrapolated it to this connection with people in your neighborhood as well. I mean, thinking about, I go to my bagel shop and they know what I want because I go there fairly often, or, stores along the 24th Street corridor, I was happy to see it was in your cluster map,
Oh, really?
the street that I live next to.
Oh, nice.
But that idea that you kind of get more connected with your community as well in terms of connecting with the people who work in the shops. And obviously they're not strong ties. I'm not going to have, lunch with all these folks, but I do know them and I do appreciate seeing them.
What you're pointing to, Jeff, I think is critical, which is that Mark Granovetter didn't really address the question in the 70s, where do weak ties come from? Let alone, strong ties are oftentimes something we don't choose. We're either born into or we professionally end up in, right? So our education dictates what kind of a job we'll get, and we'll end up with like-minded professionals that we network with or work with. And we're born into families, and sometimes we're even in religious groups or in certain social groups, not directly by our choice, but because of circumstance. But those weak ties that are so important for societies, where do they come from? And I believe that urban planning has a whole lot to do with that. And just like you just said, that your neighborhood can generate those weak ties. Your bagel shop and other shops can produce certain encounters that once you've seen a person more than a couple of times, you start remembering them and you maybe strike up a conversation, and that may become a weak tie. And cities that create such encounters, I think are really, I even refer to this concept as latent ties that are just waiting to happen, right? And you can imagine urban environments where such ties are never built because there is no encounter of that kind, right? If we are always sort of interacting with the city through a windshield of a car and only interacting with folks at home or in the office, but never really with the diversity of the rest of society that we could bump into on the city street, then there is no opportunity for these weak ties to form. This actually connects to a really interesting sort of follow-up study I'm currently involved with, and I might just mention, but we are examining the MIT campus, and we got access to this sort of anonymized data set that describes as an index how much different faculty and researchers on the campus communicate with each other by email. So we don't know who they are and not exactly how many emails, but we just have an idea of how much email communication generally occurs between individuals. And when we analyzed that data set, we found that if people are more likely to walk past each other's offices when arriving on campus, for instance, so that has to do with how their offices are spatially situated with respect to each other. But if they're situated in such a way that they're likely going to walk past each other's offices, there's more email traffic between them. If their offices are closer to each other, there's more email traffic between them. And third, if they share the same set of amenities, if they are close to the similar eateries or canteens, there's more email traffic between them. And so I think this speaks to the same idea that if city spaces put us in touch by circumstance and create chance encounters, these are the kinds of circumstances that will lead to the weak ties that Granovetter was referring to.
And the weak ties, it feels like, might have been a little damaged in the last year because of the pandemic. I'm curious of your thoughts on that, because of the need to stay inside for a lot of people, to stay away from others. If you live in a city, typically you're probably out and about because you wanted to get out of the house, so you wanted to walk down the commercial street or trying to get out at least a little bit. But at the same time, you're also probably not bouncing into those people that you might usually bounce into.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. This year has been a real test for such relationships. And I think if I were to describe what I think has occurred to weak ties in this year, is that we maybe have barely been able to sustain the ties we already have. If we're good about it, we may check in with our friends that we see normally on a normal year, once or twice a year. We may have a Zoom call with them, etc. But what we are not doing is we're not forming new weak ties. Since this aspect of bumping into each other on city streets, at businesses, on main streets, etc., is really limited throughout the pandemic, we are not expanding our networks in ways that we normally would. It'll be interesting to see in the aftermath of the pandemic what impacts that may have.
Yeah. Well, once a month we have Geo Beers here in San Francisco with a bunch of folks, and I miss my Geo Beers. We've done it on Zoom, and you see the people that you've met before, but it's also harder to have those side conversations with new people. And I've definitely met a lot of people from going to Geo Beers, so that strikes home for me. Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite retail cluster?
No, I can't really pinpoint any one that I love the most, but there are many that I find extremely interesting. And some of them are just so odd. For instance, there are a couple of streets in Hong Kong that trade birds in cages, right? And where else in the world do you find that? It's just an amazing phenomenon. Or it's always fascinating to me to go out into other specialized clusters like electronics clusters or book clusters. Many cities will have these what are called comparison goods sold in clusters, and books, shoes, art, these things that people like to kind of browse from one store to another oftentimes come in clusters. And I find it really interesting to browse through those, even though I might never buy something from an electronics cluster in some place, but it's just really fascinating to see. And that's, I think, the sort of exploratory behavior of browsing through places and maybe kind of expanding our networks and latent ties to areas we've never encountered before. I think this is the beauty of it. In Los Angeles, in California, there's this giant flower cluster in downtown as part of and I think it services most of the LA metro area. Of course, I have my local ones that I go to almost all the time here, and we're blessed to have this sort of old Anglo town planning pattern in the Boston area where there's lots of what are called squares, and squares are essentially clusters of businesses that are highly accessible and streets coming together. So I have a good handful of maybe 4 or 5 squares within walking distance of my house that I go regularly to.
Yeah, the story about Kendall Square was specifically interesting in the book, talking about how kind of they worked really hard to bring more retail to the space.
Yeah, Kendall Square is one of those interesting cases where it's home of a pretty large tech cluster, and it has a very dense built environment. In fact, it has a road network and that's highly connected. It's sort of fanning roads coming together. So it's a significantly accessible spot. And there's also a subway station, and there's MIT right at the station and so forth. But just for years has been lacking stores. It turns out that it's largely because many of those buildings are centrally owned by large companies who make boatloads of money from renting office space upstairs and haven't really cared to coordinate ground floor leases and invite in stores that would benefit everyone. So to address that shortcoming, the city stepped in, and the city basically argued that it's in everyone's interest to start putting in stores on the ground floors, and the density is more than sufficient. There's all the preconditions are there. It just kind of needed to twist the arm of some of those developers who own the buildings and say, hey, you have to actually now start putting the stores in, and it's taken off. Kendall Square it's an entirely different place from when I first moved to Boston. There several 100% increase probably by now in terms of the number of stores that are there.
Is it possible to over push ground floor retail and those type of interventions?
It is, yeah, definitely. There is another area actually quite close to Kendall Square called University Park in Cambridge, where the city just decided at one point when it was developed in the early 90s, that this was going to be a new retail cluster. And so they forced the developers to make all the ground floors commercial, or at least commercial compatible. They could even maybe have another use, but it was supposed to be easy to convert them to stores if the needs arise. And it never picked up. There are many kind of reasons for this. It's too close to some other clusters that are just around the corner at Central Square, etc. But it's still, to this day, almost 30 years after, doesn't have any significant retail cluster in it. And this is maybe an example where the public sector didn't quite do their homework to figure out whether it would work or not, and didn't do the location analysis and just sort of over-zoned it. It hasn't worked.
Speaking of analysis and detailed things, one of the things that we focus on when I used to work at an organization called the Center for TOD, we would talk about travel demand models and those types of things, and thinking about parking spaces for new development and how that was affected by subway stops, et cetera. But it seems like travel demand models can get urban retail really wrong, especially since they've been focused on this, the mall model, or at least the suburban model. Has that been, something you've experienced?
Yeah, I think travel demand models generally operate at the scale of TAZs, or travel analysis zones, or sometimes zip codes. So they're a tool for metropolitan scale mobility modeling, and to oftentimes for understanding broad flows of people from one zone to another without getting to the sort of nitty-gritty resolution that street commerce oftentimes operates in. So they may be right in terms of understanding on how many people may be coming to downtown, but street commerce is scattered in so many more clusters. And as I try to argue, the majority of it is always in small clusters because the way Zipf's law distributes things, that there's very few large ones and there's a whole lot of very small clusters distributed around. The traditional TDMs or travel demand models are not the right tool for understanding that. But there are new walkability tools that, in my lab, actually, we've been creating something called the urban network analysis tools for many years that model pedestrian trips. And the logic is very similar. We still do travel demand modeling. We basically do trip generations, but instead of zones, we use individual buildings as trip origins. There's trip distribution, which goes to individual destinations at addresses like shops or like bus stops, transit stops, parks, and so forth. And it's possible to model how people can access and predict how many people will end up visiting particular locations with these new tools.
Yeah, there's a lot of great use of the tools in the book, which I hope folks will get a chance to read. How has the book been received so far?
It's hard to actually say because it's a strange year to publish a book. There's no book tours. There's no talks in person. I've had really pleasant conversations with various folks at the university and folks back in Europe. And there's been a couple of translation requests, which I've been very pleased to see. But yeah, there's a whole lot of this lack of talking with people more casually and having a presentation or something like that, which would happen in a normal year. So it's hard to tell.
Well, it's such a novel book, and I was surprised that I didn't see more about it. I saw a couple articles, which is why I contacted you. And, I wanted to read the book and talk to you about it, but I didn't see as much as maybe some other books. And I was surprised at that because it's such a novel topic and it's such an important topic. And you even mentioned, this is something that urban planning schools and other folks, aren't talking about maybe as much as they should. So I hope when the pandemic clears, you can go on that book tour and generate some of those weak ties.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. I think in part is also it's in academia, we oftentimes work with academic presses and they may have slightly less reach than some of the trade presses that reach many more bookstores. But indeed, yeah, I hope to get back on that personal conversation and encounter soon.
Yeah. Well, where can folks find the book if they want to get a copy?
The easiest is probably the greatest mall of all, Amazon. But I also encourage people to order straight from Penn Press. They have their own order site. And most of the bookstores in parts of the United States where you can now maybe visit a bookstore, bookstores may carry it. I've seen it around, at least listed in all the major chains.
Yeah, my listeners are probably tired of hearing me say this, but bookshop.org, if you go and order from them and you type in your local bookstore, they'll give part of the proceeds to the local bookstore.
Fantastic, yeah.
You can have it delivered and then it'll give some of the proceeds. If you can't make it out to your bookstore, I highly recommend that. My local one is really awesome, so I order books from them fairly frequently. Andres, this is a great book. I really appreciate you writing it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old Daily Cities news list by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod on patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find a digital home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.